Okay, good day. Today we're going to look at two different things, and in this first video we'll be looking at the powers of the presidency and a couple of other random sort of presidency related things. So we want to be able to understand the qualifications needed to become president and explain the powers, and then the later video we'll do the roles of the president. So very basic qualifications listed in the Constitution. The first one is that the president must be a natural-born citizen. Now, for most of my life, natural-born citizen was taken by most people to mean that they were born within the United States or United States territory. However, the firm legal definition is that at the time of your birth, your parents were a United States citizen or you were born on American territory. You have to be at least 35 years old. This is the oldest position of requirement. Remember, House of Reps was 25 years old, and Senate's 30. And you had to have resided in the United States for the past 14 years. This is intended to prevent sort of like foreigners coming in and taking over. All right, the terms. The length of a presidential term is 4 years. Originally, you could serve as many four-year terms as possible, theoretically. However, the first president who really established the model for presidency, George Washington, he created a two-term tradition when he retired at the end of his second term. And so for much of the history of the Republic, 2 terms has been seen as the length. However, it's not until 1947 and the 22nd Amendment that the Constitution formally limits it to 2 four-year terms. So we saw multiple presidents before this try to run for a third term. Grant thought about it. Teddy Roosevelt tried to run for a third term. And then eventually Franklin Delano Roosevelt does run, and he serves through 3 full terms and a partial bit of a 4th term before dying in office. Talked about executive orders and privilege last week. Quick recap: executive orders are the ability of the president to change a rule, and an executive privilege is their ability to withhold information. Okay, so to the powers. We really have 6 powers that are outlined in the Constitution for the president. The first power is the power to make appointments. Right? When we talk about the appointments, we're talking about cabinet members, judges, ambassadors, heads of public agency. These are the people who will run the different departments of the executive branch. So remember, the president is responsible for executing the laws of the land. And they also have the ability to make temporary recess appointments if they're unable to fill a position and get it supported by Congress. So we've seen in the Trump administration, it became to the point where many of the main positions were recess positions. All right, our next powers are the power to convene Congress. So this just means that he can call a session, he or she, I suppose, can call a session of Congress at any point. So if they're not together in Washington, usually 2 reasons for this. One is the State of the Union address that's done in January of each year. It should be coming up in the next week or 2, probably, where they go up and say, this is what my plan is for the next year. And then the other reason was if there was some sort of foreign issue in a war potential, and they could call an emergency meeting. This was more important back in the old days where it used to take a while for Congress to get to D.C. because of rail travel and so on and so forth. These days, less of an issue. All right, much of the president's power is focused on foreign policy. And when we think about the founders, we have to remember that they were really thinking about the president as a representation for the country when dealing with outside powers rather than dealing with things that happen in the United States. So One of the powers of the presidency is the power to make treaty with a foreign nation. This can be a peace treaty, it can be a trade agreement or an alliance. However, almost all of the president's powers have a check right there, which is the requirement of the Senate to vote to confirm. So we need a strong Senate approval for any of these treaties. And this has meant that some historical treaties have not been confirmed, such as the Treaty of Versailles. However, the president in recent years, particularly since the start of the Cold War and after World War II, been empowered to make some informal agreements with foreign heads of states. These are called executive agreements, and they don't require Senate confirmation. All right, power number 4 is the veto power. So this is really the president's only formal legislative power in the making of laws in the United States. So, of course, the Congress, the House, and the Senate are responsible for making new laws. They're the ones who introduce the bills, they write the bills, they go to committee, they adjust them, and then they vote on them. Now, having passed both the House and the Senate, the president has power to say, no, I'm not going to allow this to become the law of the land. You have to make some changes. So this is a check on the legislative power, the ability of the president to veto. And so it is a way they can informally influence how the laws are written, because they can say, basically, I will veto this if you keep it exactly like this, make these changes. So we can use a recent example from the late Trump presidency, was the second COVID stimulus package. President Trump threatened to veto if the Congress went ahead with a plan to change the name of some military bases that had been named after Confederate generals. Why he decided this, but his goal was to use that particularly strongly favored legislation to get a less popular thing done for his base. It was, however, ultimately the Senate stood up to him and he backed down from that one. Now, in the case that you have a particularly obstinate president refusing to allow any bills to be passed, there is a way for the Congress to override a presidential veto, but it requires 2/3 vote in both houses. So it has to be a very popular law and a president acting in a very unpopular manner. And we don't really see that anymore. Okay, the 5th power once again goes back to that foreign policy power. So the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. This is the highest ranking officer of the military. And this was originally designed by the founders in order to put a civilian in charge of the military to prevent the possibility of a military coup, the leader of the military trying to overthrow the government. In recent years, however, the commander-in-chief power has meant that the presidency has become more powerful due to the need for quick reaction. So it used to be that the president was the head of the military, but then only the House of Representatives could declare war. So therefore, the presidency really couldn't do anything with the military without a declaration. However, we've seen with the growth of technology and the president's power as military chief, that sometimes we'll see a lot of military actions take place without a declaration of war. Most notably, the Vietnam War, which never had a formal declaration from Congress. In order to counteract that, in the 1970s, the Congress passed the War Powers Act. We'll deal with that more in the future, but this was an attempt to limit the president's power as commander-in-chief. All right, and our last power, which once again is topical this year, because usually it's topical at the end of every president's term, is the pardoning power. The pardoning power is the ability of the president to release an individual or group from punishment or legal consequences for a crime. So there's a few things they can do. They can outright pardon somebody, in which case they're absolved of any guilt for the crime and they're able to go free. They can commute a sentence, which is they say, you're still guilty for the crime, but we're going to reduce the amount of time you have to serve. Those are the two main things that the president can do. So some famous examples, of course, Richard Nixon was involved in a criminal conspiracy to break into the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. One of Gerald Ford's first actions as president was to pardon him for any involvement in that crime. His argument being that it was distracting the nation, the scandal had gone on for too long, and it was the only way to move forward and start to heal the country. We also see in the later 70s, Jimmy Carter decides to use a large group amnesty where he said anybody who had dodged the draft, anybody who refused to abide by a military draft for the Vietnam War would be forgiven. Right? This is years after the Vietnam War. Anyway, those are the powers of the presidency.